Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Stories like this aren't designed to pass through you and disappear. They don't fade when the video ends. They linger. They settle into the quiet corners of your mind. They return to you on ordinary days, while you're staring out a window, sitting in traffic, or lying awake at night, reminding you of something you almost forgot. And if you've ever experienced a moment so small it felt insignificant at the time, yet somehow it shifted the direction of your entire life, then this story is for you. Now let's begin. The office had reached that peculiar state of silence that only comes after exhaustion has fully taken hold. It wasn't peaceful, not really. It was heavy, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort you. It presses in, reminding you of everything that drained you throughout the day. Hours earlier, the space had been alive with motion and noise. Conversations layered over one another, keyboards rattled in rapid bursts, phones rang with urgency. But now all of that energy had burned itself out. What remained was stillness, thick unmoving stillness. Rows of cubicles stretched into dimness, their once busy desks now abandoned. Computer monitors cast faint blue glows, like distant signals from a world that had already moved on. Overhead lights had been switched off one section at a time, leaving behind islands of shadow between pools of pale illumination. Somewhere far off, a printer continued its stubborn hum, as if it hadn't yet realized the day was over. At one of the remaining lit desks sat Daniel. He hadn't moved in a while. His eyes were fixed on the screen in front of him, scanning a paragraph he had already read several times. The words were clear enough individually. Each sentence made sense. But together, they refused to settle into anything meaningful. They slipped through his focus, dissolving before they could take shape. He read the same line again. And again. His shoulders were tight, though not from any immediate pressure. It was something deeper than stress. Something quieter. A tension that came from realizing, without fully admitting, that work had slowly become everything. He hadn't noticed when the shift happened. No one ever does. It starts small. One late night turns into another. Then another. Eventually, it stops feeling like an exception and becomes the routine. And routines, when repeated long enough, become identity. Without realizing it, your days begin to blur into a sequence of deadlines, reminders, obligations. Time becomes something you measure in tasks completed rather than moments experienced. Daniel didn't notice how empty the office had become. He didn't notice the silence growing heavier. He didn't notice the subtle change in the air. Not until he felt it. That quiet, almost unexplainable awareness that someone else was there. He looked up. Standing beside his desk was Richard, his boss, but not the version of him Daniel was used to seeing. Richard already had his coat on. His tie was loosened, collar slightly open, as if the structure of the workday had finally relaxed its grip on him. A set of keys rested loosely in his hand, catching the dim light. His expression carried a tired smile. Not the kind worn in meetings or presentations, but something more genuine. Something unguarded. For a brief moment he didn't look like a boss. He looked like a person who had simply reached the end of a long day. Daniel straightened instinctively. Years of habit moved faster than thought. His posture shifted, his attention sharpened. The automatic response of someone conditioned to be ready. To fix, to respond, to perform. Before Daniel could speak, Richard did. And his tone wasn't authoritative. It was casual, almost hesitant. He mentioned that his wife's car had broken down earlier that afternoon. The way he said it lacked urgency. It sounded more like an inconvenience than a crisis. Then, after a slight pause, he added that she was waiting downstairs. And finally, with a small shift in his posture, as if he were softening the request, he asked if Daniel could drive her home. "It's on the way," he said. "Only if it's not a problem." The words should have been simple, but they didn't feel simple. There was something about the request that carried unexpected weight. Not because it was difficult, not because it required much effort, but because it crossed a line. Work in Daniel's world rarely overlapped with anything personal. This did. He hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, long enough to feel something shift, short enough that Richard didn't notice. "Of course," Daniel said. "No problem." Relief passed over Richard's face almost instantly. "Thank you," he replied quietly. "I mean that." Daniel shut down his computer. The screen faded to black, briefly reflecting his own tired face before going dark entirely. He grabbed his bag and stood. The two of them walked down the hallway together, their footsteps echoing softly in the emptiness. As they moved, Richard spoke about the day, about meetings that seemed to multiply endlessly, about problems that felt manageable alone but overwhelming when combined. He thanked Daniel again. More than once. More than necessary. Daniel nodded, listening, responding when needed. But something else had started to form. A quiet pressure in his chest. Not discomfort exactly. Not anxiety. Just awareness. The elevator ride was smooth and silent. A low hum accompanied their descent. When the doors opened, a wave of cool air greeted them. The underground parking garage stretched out in dim concrete tones, carrying the faint smell of rain, oil, and stillness. And that's when Daniel saw her. She stood near a silver car, arms loosely folded. Not in impatience, but in quiet composure. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't visibly frustrated. She was simply waiting. There was something about that stillness that caught his attention immediately. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. This wasn't the polished version of someone seen briefly at formal events. There were no rehearsed expressions, no social performance. Just presence. Richard introduced them properly. Her name was Emily. She thanked Daniel with a gentle sincerity that didn't feel forced. Richard handed over the keys, offered one final word of gratitude, and left. Just like that. No instructions. No expectations. Just trust. Daniel found himself holding more than just car keys. He was holding responsibility. They got into the car. The doors closed. Silence settled in. But it wasn't awkward. It was full. Daniel focused on the mechanics, starting the engine, adjusting the mirrors, pulling out of the parking space. He told himself this was simple. Just a drive. Nothing more. Emily adjusted her seat slightly and looked out the window. The city lights reflected softly across her face. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she broke the silence. "Thank you," she said. "Today went longer than expected." Daniel nodded. "That seems to be the norm lately." It was an automatic response. But something in her expression shifted. "Normal," she repeated quietly. "That word can be dangerous." He glanced at her, surprised. And just like that, without effort, without planning, the conversation changed. They skipped past small talk entirely. They spoke about long work hours. About missed dinners. About plans that never quite happened, because something more urgent always came up. Daniel found himself speaking more honestly than he expected. There was no need to impress. No image to maintain. He talked about exhaustion. Not physical, but emotional. The kind that builds slowly when you're always on. Always striving. Always measuring your worth by what you accomplish. Emily listened. Not passively, but fully. The kind of listening that makes you more aware of what you're saying. After a pause, she said something that stayed with him. "Some days," she said softly, "it feels like everything in my life has already been decided before I even wake up." At a red light, Daniel glanced over. She was already looking at him. Not judging. Not questioning. Just present. The moment lasted only a second. But something shifted. The light turned green. The city moved again. But Daniel felt different. More awake than he had in months. The drive continued. They spoke about the quiet parts of life people rarely admit. About how routine can slowly become a kind of invisible cage. About how success from the outside can look impressive, but from the inside, feel strangely empty. Emily mentioned she used to paint. Before everything became scheduled. "What happened?" Daniel asked. She smiled softly. "Life. Not bitter. Just honest." As they reached her neighborhood, the city noise faded. Streetlights stood farther apart. Shadows stretched longer. When Daniel parked, neither of them moved right away. The moment lingered. "Thank you," she said again. This time it meant more. "It was nothing," he replied. But it wasn't. They both knew that. She opened the door, then paused. I hope you don't let work take everything from you, she said gently. Not as a warning, not as criticism, but almost as care. Then she stepped out and walked toward the house. The porch light flickered on. She didn't look back, but something in Daniel had already changed. The next morning, everything looked the same. The office buzzed again. Emails filled inboxes. Meetings resumed. Richard was back to his composed professional self, as if nothing had happened. For a moment, Daniel wondered if he had imagined the night before. Until lunchtime, Richard stopped by his desk. Thanks again, he said quietly. She said you two had a good conversation. Daniel hesitated. It was meaningful, he said. Richard studied him briefly. She has a way of doing that, he replied. And then he walked away. That evening, Daniel left work on time. For the first time in months. He didn't stay late out of habit. Didn't reopen tasks that could wait. He stepped outside while the sky still held color. It felt unfamiliar. Almost rebellious. Nothing dramatic had happened. No life-changing decision. No major event. Just a conversation. A drive. A moment. But sometimes that's enough. Because change doesn't always arrive loudly. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it comes quietly. In a parking garage. In a passing conversation. At a red light in a moving city. And it reminds you of something simple. That your life is still yours. Daniel didn't quit his job. He didn't make extreme changes. But he began to shift. Slowly. Intentionally. He said no to things that didn't matter. He reconnected with people he had lost touch with. He made space for moments that weren't productive, but meaningful. And over time, those small changes became something bigger. Not a new life, but a fuller one. Months later, the memory of that night remained. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of what it revealed. That sometimes the moments that change us the most are the ones that seem ordinary at first. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever felt your life being quietly shaped by routine, then maybe this is your reminder. It doesn't take a massive decision to change direction. Sometimes, it only takes one moment. And sometimes, that moment looks completely ordinary, until it isn't.